November 12, 1955, the 200th birthday of the Prussian military reformer Gerhard von Scharnhorst, when the first volunteers received their certificates of appointment, is considered the birth of the Bundeswehr. However, this German army, after 2 lost world wars with around 10 million dead or missing soldiers, did not arise from the will of the public, but from the pressure of the United States of America. The fact that initially up to 80% of Germans surveyed rejected rearmament was also due to the fact that hundreds of thousands of former soldiers were still in prisoner of war camps. Germany was completely defeated and occupied and divided into occupation zones, and many of their former military leaders had either been executed as convicted war criminals in Nuremberg or were sitting in Allied prisons. In the spring of 1951, there were still almost 1,800. But even if the West German population had loudly demanded rearmament, the wish would have failed because of the governments of all the victorious powers, who would not have allowed any kind of remilitarization of Germany in any way. And after all, the newly founded Bundestag had also rejected rearmament in 1949. However, in the same year, the overwhelming superiority of Soviet troops in Europe also began to make NATO, which was founded that year, reconsider its position. Because by then, the superiority of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which since that year also possessed nuclear weapons, was so great that according to NATO's assessment, they would have been able to overrun the handful of divisions stationed on West German soil in the first strike, and then march all the way to the Atlantic. For this reason as well, the Christian Democratic Union government under Adenauer, which had advocated for a strong alignment with the West, had already been conducting secret negotiations with the United States government under President Harry Truman since 1950 about the establishment of regular German armed forces. The whole process was then further accelerated by the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950. With American backing, Chancellor Adenauer then tasked a rather heterogeneous group of 15 former Wehrmacht officers with a fundamental review, which was presented to him on October 9, 1950, and, named after the meeting place, the Himmerod Abbey near Wittlich, became known as the Himmerod Memorandum. 2 weeks later, on October 26, 1950, Federal Chancellor Adenauer appointed Theodor Blank, a former reserve first lieutenant and, after 1945, active in the Christian trade union movement, from the Christian Democratic Union as the Chancellor's representative for questions related to the increase of Allied troops, which was then briefly called the Blank Office. Blank, who had participated in the war as a technical inspector of the Signal Regiment in the Tank Division, then began planning with a group of former Wehrmacht officers, at first in the Villa König in Bonn, then in the infantry barracks, which was called Ermekale Barracks after a former owner of the land. One of his stated principles was that, as part of the intended concept of internal leadership, quote, something fundamentally new should be created without reference to the old Wehrmacht, with the only traditional element from earlier German armies being determined as the circle of resistance from July 20th, 1944. But with this, even before the formation began, they were already trying to square the circle, because who else was supposed to establish the army, which was officially called the New Wehrmacht until 1956, if not exclusively former officers, who certainly could not simply shed their years in the Wehrmacht, in war and peace, so easily. By the way, something many people probably don't know. The Wehrmacht was not officially dissolved on May 8, 1945, but only by the Allied Control Council, which was based in the Berlin Court of Appeal building through their Control Council Law, number 34, on August 20th, 1946. But when 5 years later, the Blank Office had hoped that applying officers would practically be lining up in front of the Ermekale barracks, they were bitterly disappointed. because many former qualified officers, due to what they felt was the unfair treatment of the highest and senior German officer corps by the Allies after the defeat, held back significantly from participating in the rebuilding. But many others, in their opinion, felt that the plans had too little to do with the German military and were more about building a copy of the U.S. Army. Instead, many general staff officers could be found in influential positions in business and industry, and had become partly responsible for the so-called economic miracle. But in order to counter the persistent refusal of many important figures, which was hindering successful planning, the former Wehrmacht generals involved in the blank planning demanded that, before the establishment of West German armed forces, the Western powers and the Adenauer government should, quote, stop the defamation of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, release soldiers convicted as war criminals if they had acted on orders or under old German laws, drop ongoing proceedings, and issue a declaration of honor for the German soldier. And in fact, on January 22, 1951, General Dwight Eisenhower, who was then the Supreme Commander of NATO in Europe, not only apologized for his previous equation of the Wehrmacht and the political leadership, but also stated, among other things, that the German soldier fought bravely for his homeland. Chancellor Dr. Adenauer also reaffirmed this before the German Bundestag on December 3, 1952. Today, before this honorable House, I would like to declare on behalf of the federal government that we recognize all the armed forces of our people who have fought honorably on land, on water, and in the air in the name of the high military tradition. Afterwards, when Adenauer was asked by circles of the former Waffen-SS whether his declaration of honor also included members of the Waffen-SS, Adenauer replied on December 17, 1952, to their spokesman, who was the former Oberstgruppenführer and Colonel General of the Waffen-SS, Paul Hauser. Dear Colonel General, in response to your suggestion, I would like to inform you that the declaration of honor I made in my speech before the German Bundestag on December 3, 1952, for the soldiers of the former German Wehrmacht, also includes the members of the Waffen-SS, insofar as they fought honorably for Germany solely as soldiers. And since the millions of veterans from both world wars were also potential voters, the Chancellor even made a pilgrimage in the election campaign summer of 1953 to the war criminals' prison of Wörl, which was located in the British zone, to visit the former commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth, the general of the Waffen-SS, Kurt Meyer. However, the Social Democratic Party, including the Member of Parliament Helmut Schmidt, also took a similar stance toward the former soldiers, whether Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS. Then, on November 12, 1955, when the Federal Minister of Defense, Theodore Blank, handed over the certificates of appointment to the volunteers, the two most important protagonists were the former Major General Hans Speidel and Lieutenant General Adolf Heusinger. However, they had to hold the caps that were officially provided to them in their hands, because Heusinger's was much too large and would have slipped over his ears. And that after 5 years of planning. Both Speidel and Heusinger had been leading advocates in 1951 for the Declaration of Honor issued by General Eisenhower, and they had also successfully used their influence to secure the release of many generals from Western Allied captivity. One of them was the former Field Marshal Erich von Lewinsky, known as von Manstein. He was, without a doubt, the most operationally gifted of all the field marshals for whom I have made this video. On March 30, 1944, after increasingly frequent disagreements with Hitler's conduct of the war, von Manstein was finally transferred to the Führer Reserve. After the war, on August 26, 1945, He was interned by the British in a prisoner of war camp near Lüneburg, and from October he was taken to Nuremberg, where he worked in a prison cell on compiling a 132-page document for the defense in the trial against the General Staff and the High Command of the Wehrmacht, which took place starting in October 1946. During his initial 4-year imprisonment in Werl prison, he was called only as a witness in the trial against the main war criminals in Nuremberg. Then, however, in 1949, by which time he was back in Werl prison, the British judiciary initiated a new trial against him. However, he was so controversial even in England that a donation account was set up there for his defense, to which Winston Churchill had also contributed £25. But despite the strong criticism of the trial, Manstein was sentenced to 18 years in Werl prison. Then, however, also at the request of Churchill, he was released from prison in May 1953 for health reasons. As for the trial conducted during the Cold War, there may have been other reasons on the British side as well. Because the Soviet side had repeatedly called on their former close ally to extradite the German field marshal, which would probably have put an end, at least for the time being, to the plans for the rearmament of Germany pushed by the United States. After his release from prison and a period of recuperation, the Blank Office involved von Manstein in the planning for the reconstruction of German armed forces until 1960, although not in an official capacity. When the former field marshal celebrated his 80th birthday on November 24, 1967, the then Inspector General, General Ulrich de Maizière, honored him with a reception at the Ehrenhain on the grounds of the Armored Troops School in Münster, and according to the New York Times, supposedly also with a grand tattoo. And at von Manstein's burial, after his death on 10th of June, 1973, the Bundeswehr accorded him all military honors. However, to this day, they have neither named a barracks after him nor mentioned him in any other way. That may be due to his punishment by Allied post-war courts for, quote, violation of the laws of war and joint responsibility for war crimes in a total of 17 counts. But why did General Ulrich de Maizière, who was above all suspicion and at that time the highest-ranking officer in the Bundeswehr, officially honor him in 1967? It is true that it is easier to classify the previously mentioned generals, Heusinger and Speidel, since neither of them was indicted in Nuremberg and were therefore considered unburdened. In 1997, the former Eichelberg Barracks in Bruchsal were renamed General Dr. Speidel Barracks after the latter, and as early as October 1986, a complex at the infantry school in Hammelburg was named after General Heusinger. But wasn't this a case of double standards, both regarding the reinstatement of both officers and the naming of barracks? I would like to emphasize that I fully recognize the difficulty both protagonists faced, as losers of a total war, first to make themselves available to their country again, and second to master the balancing act of now obeying an American commander, not knowing what else he might have up his sleeve regarding their activities during Second World War. That may have played a role in the early, almost ingratiating decision to turn the early German army into a caricature of the U.S. Army, starting at the top with the M101 steel helmet, the metal unit insignia, all the way down to the rubber bands for the trouser legs. As for Speidel, who had been awarded the German Cross in Gold and the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, in 1944, as Chief of Staff of Army Group B under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, he had unsuccessfully tried, just like Field Marshals Günther von Kluge and Walter Model later, to persuade others to resist Hitler. After the assassination attempt on the 20th of July, 1944, Speidel, who had been promoted to lieutenant general on 1st January, 1944, was arrested as a possible accomplice. However, he received a second-class acquittal from the so-called Army Honor Court, chaired by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, which saved him from the People's Court. Nevertheless, he remained imprisoned in Küstrin Castle, which was destroyed in 1945. Then, after he was transferred in April 1945 for further imprisonment to Immenstadt Castle on Lake Constance and continued to be held there, he managed to escape until he was able to surrender to French troops. All of this in his biography may have contributed to the fact that Speidel became head of the overall Armed Forces Department in the Blank Office from 1950 during the planning phase, and, as was almost predicted by the bitterly satirical caricature of the German Democratic Republic's propaganda 7 years later, by then the Bundeswehr was 2 years old. From April 1957 to 1963, he served as a 4-star general and commander-in-chief of the Allied NATO land forces in Central Europe. Back then, from August 1953 to 1967, the headquarters for this was located in Fontainebleau Castle, 70 kilometers south of Paris. And as you can see from Wikipedia, the French President Charles de Gaulle, who had been in office since January 1959, did not see Speidel as a friend or ally, because of his involvement in June 1940 in the German military persecutions against the resistance, which had been infiltrated by communists and also included Jews. Instead, the French president repeatedly pushed for Speidel's replacement at NATO, who was also the commander of the French troops under NATO command, until this finally happened at the beginning of September 1963. Before that, in this situation, such communist propaganda posters had been brought into play, and 130 sons of the partisans killed in 1940 had refused French military service because they did not want to serve under Speidel, whom they held partly responsible for the deaths of their fathers. At the end of a long process, they were then allowed to fulfill their military service in the overseas territories and in the French colonies of Africa, since the French troops there were not under NATO command. Speidel, here with General Heusinger and a French general, retired from the Bundeswehr in March 1964 at the age of 66, passed away on November 28, 1984 in Bad Honnef, and was buried in Stuttgart with full military honors. Although Speidel had served several times as chief of staff of an army group during the war, his activities were always limited to a specific area. Adolf Heusinger's activities were of a completely different caliber. For example, the harshly punished Field Marshal von Manstein commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers directly at the front and was theoretically responsible even for the misconduct of individuals. Heusinger, from 1937, served in the Operations Department of the General Staff at the Army High Command in Berlin, and from October 15, 1940, he was the head of this department, which was responsible for the strategic and operational leadership of the Army units. This effectively made him number 3 in the Army's planning hierarchy. Heusinger, who was promoted to lieutenant general in 1943, whose highest war decorations in World War II were the clasp to the Iron Crosses from World War I, as well as the War Merit Cross Second Class in 1939, which was mocked by the Lancers as the Rear Echelon Medal, and later the First Class with Swords, had essentially participated in all the operational planning of the war. Against Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, and finally in 1941, also in the one that began on June 22, Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, and the summer offensive of 1942, Operation Blue. Since August of that year, he had been tasked with organizing the fight against partisans in the occupied territories, and when he was even chief of the Army General Staff for a few weeks in July 1944, he stood next to Hitler when the bomb planted by Colonel Count von Stauffenberg detonated at the Führer headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. After the war, Heusinger described this experience in detail. But if you objectively look at his career at the Führer headquarters, you have to ask yourself, since he never spent a single day at the front, whether he should be judged the same way as Manstein. Because the events he helped plan made all of this possible in the first place, for which a number of German generals were either executed after the war, sentenced to long prison terms like Manstein, or later banned from any public office in West Germany. In contrast, as a co-initiator of the operations and always an obedient follower of orders, he had already had significant influence on planning in the blank office since 1952, later held top positions in the Bundeswehr and NATO, and ultimately even served as a member of the NATO Military Committee in Washington. All of this, however, had a bitter aftertaste, since members of the Personnel Review Committee had declared in June 1957 that, after his interview, they had classified Heusinger as unsuitable for reinstatement in the Bundeswehr. Whether double standards were applied is something everyone must decide for themselves. But as for the motto issued by the weak First Defense Minister, Theo Blank, about a complete break from any internal and external traditions of earlier German armies, that was nothing more than a cheap way to appease the public. Because, for example, the general obligation to salute in the Wehrmacht, the strict superior-subordinate relationship, or the very formal behavior toward an officer during peacetime had long since given way to a spirit of camaraderie and combat unity among the millions of frontline soldiers during the war years. Therefore, the articles of the new Bundeswehr Soldiers Act and the superior regulations were, in principle, simply a continuation of the practices that had already been established. When the unfortunate Theodor Blank resigned on October 16, 1956, and was replaced by the tough Christian Social Union politician Franz Josef Strauss, a healthy soldierly spirit was able to develop in the units and formations, which were led exclusively by former highly decorated Wehrmacht officers. Everything was almost like it used to be in peacetime. The officers saluted casually and not stiffly like recruits during a salute inspection. The non-commissioned officers yelled during basic training, as if their lives depended on it, and the sergeants searched for the very last speck of dust during room inspections. Deceased Wehrmacht officers with the Knight's Cross received an honor guard, like here in 1988, Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich Bruns in Oldenburg. Many figures from the Old Army, the Reichswehr, and the Wehrmacht were guests of the Bundeswehr, like here in 1961, the 91-year-old Colonel Außerdienst Siegfried Graf zu Eulenburg-Wicken at the Guard Battalion during the adoption of the tradition of the Prussian 1st Foot Guards Regiment. And something else will especially surprise younger viewers. In the period starting in 1951, when Field Marshal Außerdienst von Manstein was appointed honorary chairman of the Association of German Soldiers, countless so-called traditional associations were founded in West Germany, which could be found everywhere in the relevant soldiers' literature. As you can see here, there were associations of soldiers from the time of the German Empire, the Reichswehr, and of course the countless regimental and divisional associations of all branches and parts of the Wehrmacht from the era of the Second World War. What is surprising today is that their chairmen could be found openly with their names, addresses, and sometimes even phone numbers without anyone being bothered by it. And another phenomenon, which would certainly be unthinkable today, was the enthusiastic advertising that was printed on the pages of the traditional associations. There you can find advertisements from reputable publishers like Brockhaus, Bernhard und Gräfe, Mittler und Sohn, Atheneum, and Musterschmidt. For the rheumatism remedy Togol, the Military History Museum in Rastatt Castle, the Nuremberg, as well as the German Wartenversicherung, the Postbank, and advertisements from Dampfkraftwagen, one of the car brands of Auto Union, from which Audi AG later emerged. Because the millions of veterans from the wars were also potential customers and, of course, voters. And politicians like the Free Democratic Party chairman, Major Dr. Erich Bende, who acknowledged his military past, wore the Knight's Cross he had been awarded on his tuxedo at official events, apparently much to the delight of Federal Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who is standing on the right edge of the picture. It was this thoroughly unmilitary, non-serving chancellor who preferred to see Federal Border Guard officers in front of his official residence rather than Bundeswehr soldiers, because to him, the Federal Border Guard looked more German than the Honor Guard battalion with their shiny US M1 helmets. As for the cautious and constitutionally appropriate tradition maintained until the end of the 1960s regarding previous German armies, a first turning point came on 1st of July 1965 with the so-called Tradition Decree issued by Defense Minister Kai Uwe von Hassel. This decree was considered necessary because, by then, both politicians and younger officers regarded the immediate predecessors of the Bundeswehr, the Reichswehr, and the Wehrmacht as institutions hardly worthy of tradition. But both in this and in the subsequent so-called tradition decrees, as well as earlier during the planning of the Bundeswehr, an attempt had been made to square the circle. For this reason, the decree lists as prerequisites for establishing tradition the timeless soldierly virtues already known from earlier times, such as bravery, chivalry, decency, loyalty, modesty, comradeship, truthfulness, decisiveness, and conscientious fulfillment of duty, virtues that, apart from bravery, should actually be observed by every civilian as well. Furthermore, examples of military excellence were also listed as tradition-establishing behavior, such as outstanding leadership of troops, which are recognized in the Bundeswehr and can be used in teaching and training. But then quickly adding the sentence that these, however, must always be evaluated in their historical context and cannot be separated from the political goals they served. And as can be seen from an example in Manstein, local politicians can now use this leverage to remove the names of officers from the Imperial Army from barracks, even against the resistance of the population. So in November 2022, the Christian Democratic Union representative responsible for Koblenz had justified the renaming of the Dein Bruchmüller barracks, which were named after artillery generals, to Rittersturz Barracks, with the words, "The goal of changing the name of the barracks is fundamentally understandable." The artillery officer Georg Bruchmüller, because of his past in the First World War, does not represent a modern Bundeswehr and the democratic values of the Federal Republic. However, the name Rittersturz has nothing to do with Manstein. Rather, it was the name of a former hotel in Koblenz. But a question must also be allowed in this context. If General Bruchmüller, who retired on January 18, 1919, is already considered unworthy as a namesake due to his, quote, past in the First World War, what about the protagonists who participated in the Second World War as officers and later became defense ministers, chancellors, or even federal presidents? Christian Democratic Union, lieutenant in the Wehrmacht, High Command Abwehr Department under Admiral Canaris, Kai Uwe von Hassel. Christian Democratic Union, Army Captain Franz Josef Strauss. Social Democratic Party, Air Force, Captain Helmut Schmidt. Free Democratic Party, Air Force Night Fighter, Captain Walter Scheel or General Johannes Steinhoff, after whom even a squadron is named. As for the traditional associations, their dissolution began at the end of the 70s, also due to the passing of the members from the Reichswehr and the Old Army, as well as the aging of the protagonists of the Second World War. When, proverbially, the old lion was on his deathbed, this generation was no longer of political interest as voters and was accordingly ignored by the parties. The final break with the last remnants of cautious, backward-looking tradition preservation in the Bundeswehr came in 1995 with the highly controversial Wehrmacht exhibition, but that's another topic. Finally, a word about the supposedly so strongly practiced Bundeswehr tradition. For that, you only have to look at the Irmakale Barracks, the longtime headquarters of the Blank Office, where in 1951 the cradle of the Bundeswehr stood. The barracks were still used by various federal agencies until 2013 after the move to Hardhöhe, and from 2015 on, they were used to house asylum seekers. By now, this now civilian building is nothing more than a slightly run-down complex, forgotten by the Bundeswehr, which, instead of making grand speeches about its tradition, could have built a museum there dedicated solely to the founding generation of the early years of the Bundeswehr during the Cold War. To the career and temporary soldiers and the millions of conscripts who served in the Army until the mid-1990s, which Harvard professor John Lewis Gaddis described in his 1995 standard work on the Cold War as probably the best army in the world during that time. It almost seems like one of history's ironies that people like Theodor Blank and the non-traditionalists who advised him at the time have themselves now fallen into considerable oblivion. I think that's what you call karma.